Evening, everyone. Hello, we're going to discuss Brexit today. Do you know what? I almost never talk about Brexit in the live streams for some reason. I don't know why. But we had a little bit of a moment this week. It's nothing new as such, but it is, it's an official position that the Bank of England governor has now talked about Brexit as being a barrier to economic growth. And the Chancellor has described it as a source of structural challenges, which means the same thing. It is a problem, not an opportunity, not something that's working well and we should nurture it. No, this is a problem. And for a lot of people, you may think, well, this is no, I mean, we've known this for a long time, Phil. It's like, yes, but it hasn't been officially stated by the government or by the Bank of England. So it is actually quite a big thing. But what I thought I would do is go over, inevitably when I discussed it, you get some people who come out with why we shouldn't reverse Brexit. And it's the same comments. And so I did a post in the community tab earlier, just asking for other people. So what are the arguments for sticking with Brexit, at least the form of Brexit that we have, that still seem to persist, so we can go over them. And so I've put some of them down. The first one that sparked it off for me, I'll kick off with this. Mark's just got one in there. It says, listen to LBC earlier. People still believe the EU are punishing us for leaving rather than treating us as a third nation, which is what we asked for. Exactly. I mean, this is the problem. But I mean, I wish I could sort of say to people that think that is, you were told that we would hold all the cards. It's Remainers that said that the EU will treat us like a third country, and that is not something you want to be treated like. And, when they talk about punishment, the way the EU are treating us is the same way as they treat the United States. Whenever I've seen a Daily Express article saying, oh, the EU are punishing us because they're doing this thing, it's like they do that for Americans. And America is like the largest economy in the world. The EU does not punish America, does it? That'd be mad. The only time the EU ever punishes America is when America tries to start a trade war, which may happen again. I mean, that's, we could be looking at that in the not too distant future. We may well be able to say, yes, the EU are punishing America. Why? Because America's trying to punish the EU. But they don't start it. And so every time it's like, oh, they're going to do this thing. Oh, they're just punishing us. No, they're treating us like a third country. They do the same with Americans. They do the same with Canadians. Everyone loves Canadians. They do the same with, Japanese citizens, Chinese, wherever. It's third country. Consequence of it. Anyway, first one is a classic, but it's still doing the rounds. And this, I've quoted this exactly, including the capitalisation there of will of the people, as if they're proper nouns. Brexit is the will of the people. There is no going back. Please respect democracy. So let's go through bit at a time here. So will of the people. First of all, no, it was never the will of the people. The proportion of the people who voted for it in 2016 was about a quarter of the population. Now, I'm not going to make a big deal of the fact it was this relatively small number that voted for it. It was a majority. That's how democracy works. That's fine. But it wasn't you cannot say it's the will of the people if it's not even a large minority. We're not even talking 45% here. You're talking about 26%, I believe it was, of the population. So, no, it wasn't. But the other thing is, like we say there's no going back. Of course there is. We can apply to join. Easy way to go back. You could have said Brexit was the will of the people. You cannot say Brexit is the will of the people because you need to measure it. If you're going to say that people haven't changed their minds in 8 years, where's your evidence? Because all the polling suggests otherwise, right? All the polling suggests otherwise. Not as strongly as some rejoin groups try to claim, but it does still suggest that we shouldn't have done it. So, polling says it's not the will of the people. So are you going to test it in a way that's better than polling, consistent polling? The only way you could test it is with another referendum, couldn't you? Or some sort of poll, even if it was another, advisory poll. Then the other thing about please respect democracy. Well, here's the thing. We had a referendum on membership in the 70s and people voted to stay. So why wasn't that respected? Also, if we're going to... some people will say, oh, that was the EEC. We were fine with the EEC. It was just the EU. It's like, well, we helped build the EU. So how does that work? But if you're going to argue that, it's like, okay, so respect democracy. Does that mean Labour don't have to worry about any future elections then? They won this huge majority. That's will of the people, isn't it? Does that mean that we shouldn't bother with any more elections? Because I'm pretty sure that's not what they mean. And you say to yourself, so why should we have another election in 4 or 5 years' time, a general election? Why would you? And they'll just say, well, because people may, having seen Labour in government, decide they don't want that after all. Democracy, yeah? So you have another vote. Well, I'm not suggesting you have a vote every few years on a matter like Brexit, but when all the polling indicates that it is not the will of the people, and even when supporters of Brexit say it has not delivered what they thought it would, there are still people who still support Brexit, and yet if you ask them, so what were you promised that was delivered, they don't know. They'll say, no, well, we didn't get what we were promised. So, it's not even the will of Brexiteers. Brexit is not even the will of Brexiteers, because there's a really small, even of Brexit voters, people who voted leave, polling also shows this, only a minority of those think Brexit has delivered what they were promised. So, Brexit's not even the will of the Brexiteers. It's absolutely madness. And we'll catch up with a couple of comments here. The problem is the press won't admit that Brexit was a disaster. As soon as they do, the general public will follow. Well, the media... do you know what? You point out any problem in politics. I always get on my high horse with this. You point out any problem with politics. And do you know what? It always comes down to the way the media skew public opinion. By either not reporting on certain things or over-amplifying the reporting of other things. Everything. I don't even blame politicians. I don't even blame the really rotten ones. I didn't blame Boris Johnson for Brexit, really. It's the media. If the media had reported about the EU factually, accurately, over the years, over the decades, Boris Johnson would never have, because he didn't want to back Brexit. I'm not saying he gets a pass, but he would never have backed Brexit because he'd have known there was no possibility of winning anyone over that way. But anyway, there we go. Gareth saying try and watch the rugby while listening to this. Do you know what? I don't watch sport anymore. I used to watch quite a bit. I went through this phase. I used to watch television and then I stopped watching television, but I would carry on watching sports. Now I don't even watch sports. No idea what's going on half the time. I occasionally just check results and that's about it, just for old time's sake. James there saying 26 was my voting debut. Yeah, it's but Puninator I know says he wasn't able to vote in that election. This is the thing now. We're now in a position where people who were just slightly too young to be able to vote are now in their mid-20s. And this is the thing to look at it as well when when you're talking about rejoining the EU, like unless the EU actually does collapse. You can't say in 100 years' time everything's going to still be in place, because you look at the last 100 years and you look at like the shape of geopolitics and it's massively different. So of course in the next 100 years, assuming the human race is still around in 100 years, it will be different still. But if you're thinking in terms of the next couple of generations, assuming the EU doesn't actually fulfill the Daily Express's wet dream, and assuming the EU is still a thing and it's still growing and it sorts itself out and it somehow deals with Trump and it somehow deals with Russia and and what emerges hopefully is stronger. The reality of the situation is, this will of the people is, we know that the majority of Brexit voters, Leave voters, were older people, and the majority of Remain voters were younger people. And this isn't like younger people voting for progressive parties when they're young and then tending to shift towards conservative parties when they're older, because there's a cause and effect there. It's because as you get older and you get on the housing ladder, you get a bit of money, you're a bit secure, all of a sudden you start to care about taxes, right? And the Conservatives always bang on about taxes. There's nothing like that with the EU. It's not something where you naturally become more anti-EU as you get older. It was purely, it was purely about people who remembered life before we joined even the EEC, and they thought life was better then when it absolutely was not. What they were remembering was being young and fit and full of dreams, and life for them was good because they weren't creaking every time they tried to stand up, and they weren't wheezing every time they went up the stairs. So that's not coming back. Every generation that comes up, and I know Nigel Farage has got his hooks into some of the younger ones, but every generation that comes up is going to be largely pro-EU. So we've already got people who couldn't even, and the ones who did vote overwhelmingly to remain, they're now entering their 30s. They're into their 30s. And you just think in another 10 years' time, they're in their 40s. The ones who weren't able to vote are in their 30s. There's a whole new generation coming up that's no idea what's going on, but they're not going to be afraid of the EU. So we are going back. We're going back. This will of the people is an absolute nonsense. But it would just be nice, if you ever come across someone who talks about this will of the people, just to say, link it to other democratic situations like elections. Are you saying that we should not have elections then? Well, why not? Why don't we just have one election, elect governments, and then why don't we only have elections when MPs die or retire? So an MP wins a seat, that's will of the people. So why do they have to fight the election a few years' time? Why don't we just leave them there? It's obviously the will of the people. Why don't we just leave them there? People instinctively know that that's stupid because people can change their mind. As soon as you get that person to say people can change their mind, then it's like, anyway, just say sovereignty. Okay, well we'll carry on because that's not the last one. I've got sovereignty somewhere here. Have I? I might not have. Maybe not. We'll come to the sovereignty one is an awkward, because you ask people, what does that mean? What does sovereignty mean? Or it means we set our own rules, but we don't set our own rules. We did in the EU, and this is a point I would make. We did in the EU. So right now, if you are a business that makes something, because put it this way, if you didn't do anything, if you didn't buy or sell or anything like that, you didn't have to follow, not everyone had to follow EU rules. I didn't have to follow very many EU rules. I was a teacher, right? So most of the rules I followed were set by the UK government. Very few. And the ones that were EU-wide were also ones that the UK government already had in place anyway, usually. So I didn't really have to. But if you're a business that buys or sells something, so if you're buying something from the EU, you're following EU rules, because you know what? Those goods are manufactured to EU standards, yeah? So you're effectively buying goods that comply with EU regulations. However, they're not decided by our government. Now, when we were a member of the EU, our government got a say in those rules. So if there was a particular rule to do with manufacturing, products, we could say, well, hang on a minute, that's not in our interests. So we could try and block it. We were quite powerful. So we had a really good chance of being able to block any rules we didn't think were in our interests. So now we are following those rules. If we are going to import something from the EU, it's going to be made to EU standards. So we're sort of forced to go along with that now. Only we don't get a say in it. But then it goes the other way. So let's say you're selling to the EU. Well, you're still following EU rules, because your product has to meet the requirements of that market, otherwise you can't sell into it. So manufacturers in this country, if they want to sell to the EU at all, they have to make sure they comply with EU rules. So we're still following EU rules, only we don't get a say in it. We don't get to vote for anyone who has a say in those rules, but we still have to follow them. So we've actually lost sovereignty. So although it is technically true, yes, you do cede some sovereignty, not all, some sovereignty when you join a larger bloc like the EU. Yes, there are some rules that are going to be decided at the EU level. And yes, in theory, if you want one thing, but the whole rest of Europe says, no, 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 we don't want that, we're going to be overruled. That happens. It happens in like 2 or 3% of cases. So you cede some sovereignty. But do you know what? You lose more sovereignty by not being in it. And that's the thing. It's like the cost, isn't it? It's that sovereignty that you effectively pay as an investment because you get more back. Because then you get to decide things on a Europe-wide level. So that actually gives you more clout globally. Because remember, the EU is the gold standard of quality. Wendy Hego in Scotland votes saying the EU unicorns and all. Well, the unicorns wasn't in reference to Scotland as it happens, but yes, it's like my Brexit background now. But let's go on to another one. So where's another? Here's a good one. Freedom of movement. This is a classic. It ended freedom of movement. Priti Patel's been banging on about this yesterday, I think it was. It ended freedom of movement. As if that's a good thing. So, I mean, let's have a look. Freedom of movement. So as a result of losing our freedom of movement, we now have problems trading, which means that goods cost more because just even something as simple as delays in getting goods into and out of the country means that we have to pay more, and that cost is passed on to the consumer. It also means when you're trying to go on holiday, I mean, we see it every time, every holiday season, queues at Dover. It's every time. It's like, and the news goes on about it as if it's a surprise every time. And it's like, look, I can tell you exactly when there's going to be massive queues at Dover. I can point out the times of the year when it's going to happen. And then you get other ones like when ES comes in and stuff like that. So we're going to actually have massive problems when all these other things come online. But even at the moment. So how's freedom of movement benefited? And then what will they say? But it was to control immigration. Was it? So let's have a look at these immigration figures then. Let's have a little look. House of Commons immigration figures. So you see the point at which they spike upwards. That's after Brexit, that is. That's immediately after Brexit, in fact. Straight away. That is the point at which we left the single market. Boom. And I get how it's counterintuitive. I do get it. I appreciate that. People will go, well, if you end freedom of movement, you naturally think that means immigration will be lower. And I totally get how it's counterintuitive. And I totally get why, as an argument, it didn't work during the Brexit debate. No, actually, immigration will go up. Because people argued that. No, immigration will go up. I completely understand how an ordinary member of the public is just going to look at you and go, that's just stupid, you're an idiot. Appreciate it. But it did. The proof is there, it did. So why did it go up? Tony Blair, I mean, there's multiple reasons why, by the way. But Tony Blair had a good explanation for it. He said, look, the situation is we have certain jobs. We've actually in this country got statistically full employment. Full employment doesn't mean everyone has a job. We know there are some unemployed people, right? But it just means the level of unemployment is so low that it's like if you get rid of a load of people from the workforce, you can't replace them. That's what it means. So people who are unemployed either don't have the skills for the vacancies in their area, or there just aren't many vacancies in their area, because sometimes you have concentrations of people where the jobs are not, and then you've got the vacancies where you've not got that many people. Yeah. So statistically speaking, we've got full employment. So basically, we do need people to come into the country to do those jobs. I mean, that's just a fact. We don't have those people ourselves, and they go, oh, we should just British people. We haven't got the British people, mate. We haven't got them. We'll have more babies. We're having fewer babies. Do you know why we're having fewer babies? Because it costs too much. And do you know what happens when someone has kids and they read this in the papers? What happens when there's a cost of living crisis or something like that, and people go, oh, I need help for this. Well, you shouldn't have had kids if you can't afford them. So now what's happening is people are going, money's too tight, we can't afford kids. So the birth rate's now below the death rate. People aren't having kids. So we're going to need immigration. It's really that simple. Or we accept a smaller economy. we accept that we cannot be a big economy. We're going to have to get smaller and smaller. It's really that simple. So we need immigration. It was made more difficult to get people from Europe to do those jobs. So what had to happen is we had to get those people from Asia and Africa. And the government did that. The government had a huge recruitment drive, not just individual companies. The government, the Tory UK Brexit government, actually spent public money trying to attract people from Africa and Asia to come to the UK to work because we needed them. And as Tony Blair explained, so if you get someone from like France or Belgium doing some work over here, they may just move here themselves and keep popping back home, you know, for their families and stuff like that. Whereas if you're coming from Africa or Asia, yeah, you're bringing your family because it's a hell of a long way. You know, it's a pretty big move. So you effectively increase the level. And if you think things like the Conservatives tried to do last year, well, we'll just stop them bringing those so-called dependents, by the way. Some of those dependents, by the way, also work. We'll just stop them bringing those dependents. Then you won't get the worker. And then the vacancies. You know, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. It's really this simple. I get how you could tell people all day long, ending freedom of movement will actually make immigration go up, and they will just go, you're an idiot, mate. And I totally get how they would think that. But now we've got the data. Prior to that, why, when discussing Brexit, do you focus on the economic benefits of the EU? Likened by priorities, join is the peace EU brought to Europe. Yeah, people in this country don't care about that. I'll tell you why. Or this is my opinion why. I don't know this as a fact. Just to be clear between fact and opinion. I'll tell you why. It's always been said that the UK's attitude towards the EU was mercantile. Now, we're not alone in this. We were to begin with, but we're not anymore. I would also say that a lot of European countries are as well, like Hungary especially, but, you know, other countries that joined a bit later, Central and Eastern Europe, that fell under the shadow of the old USSR. Theirs is also fairly mercantile. They want, you know, they want the economic benefits. But the reason why the UK joined purely for the economic benefits is because for a lot of people in Europe at the time, I think this actually is weakening now. I can see evidence that this is weakening in Europe. But at the time, you know, if you're talking going back to the 1960s and 70s when the EU was being conceived, as it is now, people still remember the Second World War, and virtually every country in Europe had been invaded by another country. Virtually every single one. So for them, that peace was a huge carrot. But for people in Britain, we weren't successfully invaded in living memory. It's a long time. We have been successfully invaded, but a very long time ago. So no one remembers it. So if you talk about the peace project, it's very easy for people in Britain, even in the 70s, to be, I mean, no one's against, well, a large population aren't against peace, but they don't actually think, because they'll think, well, we fought off the Nazis, so, you know, we're okay. And that is why. So the reason why I talk about the economic benefits all the time, it's the only argument that will work. It's the only argument that will work in this country. Not enough people, they take peace for granted. At the end of the day, the EU is, and its forebears, is provably the biggest and best peace project in human history, because Europe went to war every generation. Like, what was the long? I don't know. There's probably been maybe a 20 or 30 year period, sometimes dotted here or there, where Europe wasn't at war with itself or the major powers. Basically, Europe was constantly at war amongst major powers. Occasionally, the odd one sat it out, but, you know, mostly at war for thousands of years, or at least over 1,000 years. And all of a sudden, we had this period of peace, which was unbeknownst. But people take it for granted now. You just take it for granted. Like when I was unemployed and I couldn't afford heating, so I couldn't have hot water, for example. So when I got a job and was able to afford it, I had like a bath every day, not shower, a bath every day, hot bath. Because you know, it was something I'd done without. But now I take it for granted again. Because you get used to it. So that's why I talk about the economic side of it all the time. It is the only argument that will work in this country. But anyway, there is that one. So there's freedom of movement. What's another one? Oh, this is where is it? EU bureaucracy. We escaped EU bureaucracy. I think I've sort of already done this one, haven't I? No, we haven't. I mean, first of all, remember bureaucracy. So it has two meanings. It depends what they mean. Bureaucracy, strictly speaking, in terms of the literal definition of the word, just means the administration of policy. So we need bureaucracy, otherwise nothing happens. If you don't have bureaucracy, you don't have roads, you don't have railways, you don't have hospitals, you don't have GP surgeries, you don't have post offices, you don't have anything. You have caves. We're back to living in caves, right? Anyone know a good cave? But people will also use it to mean overly burdensome red tape. Well, we didn't escape it. We got more, didn't we? Because in fact, the EU exists. If your meaning of bureaucracy, which is a valid meaning, by the way, is in the dictionary for this purpose, is overburdensome administration, red tape, form filling, whatever you want to call it, stuff that shouldn't be needed, the EU actually exists to get rid of it. It was a madness to me that people weren't hammering the fact that EU exists to reduce that form of bureaucracy. It gets rid of it. You know, if you were a company wanting to sell in Britain, wanting to sell to Belgium, you want to send something off to Belgium, you used to just, you get your order in, you go, okay, right, you get your stuff packaged, you put your invoice in it, send it off, gone. That's it, that's all you had to do. That's your paperwork, invoice. The same paperwork to go from Birmingham to Bristol as to go from like Birmingham to Bruges. Now, if you want to send it there, you've got to first of all demonstrate that it meets, if you're going to try and get it tariff free, by the way, you need to demonstrate that it meets rules of origin. If it's above a certain level in value, you may have to pay VAT. You've got your customs forms to fill in. So you've got a whole stack of paperwork now to fill in. So we didn't escape EU bureaucracy. We got Brexit bureaucracy. So that should be a really easy one to dismiss. Anyone who tries to come up with that, it's really easy. Now we got, so I mean, ask any, and if put it personally to them, you name me some bureaucracy you had in 2019 that you don't have now. Because do you know what? We even have extra red tape to vote in this country. We actually have extra red tape in this country. Our Brexit government very kindly said, oh, by the way, to vote, you've got extra forms to fill in now. That's nice. So, you know, we got extra red tape. But anyway, Viv said, I think my generation, baby boomers, remember growing up post-war, so I can't understand why so many old bods voted for Brexit. Peace with everything for me. I tell you, I just think it's the classic nostalgia. When people think back to their youth, it happens in every generation. We've got records of this going back to the 18th century. Ever since diarists used to write about life in their time, you can see examples of it. Every generation, when it gets to like the older generation, thinks that life was better when they were young. And it's never been better. Actually, now, no, I am going to say, if you're about my age, there will be some people my age who can look back at their youth and think life was better, because it probably was. Because there are people in their 40s now who, since the banking crash, are in a worse position than they were. So they've been maybe in their 20s, late 20s, I guess. And, and maybe, life was getting better and then suddenly it crashed. So there will be. But by and large, every generation, life has gotten better for most people. And so what they were remembering was just being young. They remember, we were the sick man of Europe. We joined, we did believe, our governments did believe in the political project, by the way. They believed in the peace, but Winston Churchill pushed it. And he pushed it for that reason. He didn't push it to make Europe rich. He pushed it to make Europe peaceable. He had this fear of this East-West. He sort of predicted the Cold War, and he wanted the West to be strong because obviously he's on the side of the West. And he pushed this project as a peace project for practical reasons. He just didn't think at first the UK should be part of it because he thought there should be three bulwarks of Western powers. There was going to be a united Europe. There was going to be the United States of America, which was even at the time emerging as the superpower. And there was going to be the Commonwealth. So this was obviously still in the days of empire, right? So the British Empire, effectively, although we weren't really calling it that then, it was like the Commonwealth, was going to be the third. But obviously, the breakup of the empire meant that all of a sudden, those individual countries weren't interested in, some of them weren't necessarily interested in being aligned with the West either. They had their own interests. So it weakened. So at that point, Churchill was still alive at the point we tried to enter the EEC. And he did actually say this is probably for the best, because his plan with the Commonwealth had failed. So let's have a look. Where were we? Get rid of that one. This is a weird one. It came up a few times. Worth it for Remain it is. You do see this sometimes. This should be straight easy. If someone's going to say it's worth it for Remain it is, what they're basically saying is they're acknowledging that Brexit's a good thing because it harms the UK. Because you're talking about, there's roughly the same number of Leave and even in 2016 there were roughly the same number of Leave and Remain voters. Leave voters there was slightly more, right? Slightly more, but it was very, very close. But nowadays it's even it's basically evens, I think, because statistically there's a greater number of Leave voters died than Remain voters, because the vast majority of older people voted for Brexit and the vast majority of younger people did not. So statistically, at this point, I think it's been worked out, it's basically evens. So you're talking about it's worth it because you've divided the country. Only a madman would actually put it in those terms. I suspect these people mostly exist just on Twitter. Rather than in real life. But maybe the odd person in real life will come to you and say, well, it's worth it because it upset Remainers, in which case you're saying, so you think it's worth it because it weakened the UK? Because if you divide a population against itself, like a house cannot stand if it's divided type of thing. If you have a country that's divided against itself, it's a weaker country. So that's what you're arguing. This is a good one. Our billions not paid into EU coffers warms the heart. I think someone replied to... who was it now? I've forgotten who it was. Terry Christian, I think it might have been, on Twitter. Our billions not... So but this comes up a bit, doesn't it? Well, we're no longer paying all those billions into the EU. Well, let's just have a little think about this. So our net contribution to the EU was about £7.5 billion back in 2019. That was because remember, of our membership fee, which itself was like, what was it, about 17 billion or something? We used to get, we had the rebate as well, of course, but we used to get some of that money coming back our way for like development projects in deprived areas, because the EU are really good at that. You notice the government said that they would, all these EU projects that were going on, the government, of course, were going to comp that. Oh, well, we'll just pay for it out of the money we're saving. They didn't, did they? But the reason is they're not saving any money. So our net so we were net contributors to the EU funds. Our net contributions were about 7.5 billion a year, right? In today's money, that's about £9 billion, right? Now, as I've just said recently, if you look at the OBR analysis for how much lower productivity is now compared with where it would be if we'd still be in the EU, if those trade barriers didn't exist, that works out at the current rate of tax to be about a bit over £40 billion, and that's every year. So it's like, and that's not the total cost, that's just the lost revenues to the Treasury. Think that the government also has to spend public money in order to build and maintain the infrastructure needed to maintain those trade barriers. So your lorry parks in Kent, the extra facilities in Dover and Belfast, Liverpool, Hull, everywhere else as well. So all of that extra infrastructure needs paying for from public funds. And that all comes in tax as well. But just purely in terms of taxes lost, it's just over £40 billion a year. And our net contribution in today's money used to be £9 billion a year. This is like, I'll tell you what this is like. This is like someone giving up their job because they go, oh, I have to keep travelling. It's costing me a fortune petrol. I know, I'll give up my job and I'll get a better paid job further away. Because that makes sense. But that's what they thought, isn't it? Well, we'll give up the EU and we'll get better trade deals at the other end of the world. Yeah, good one. But that's what it's like. So someone gave up their job because they didn't like paying the petrol to get a better paid job further away, and then they didn't get that job because we didn't get the good trade deals because they don't exist. That's what it's like. Our billions not been paying to EU coffers. I mean, first of all, we are still paying because we're going to have to pay for Nigel Farage's MEP pension in a few years. But we used to pay, our net contribution was in today's money about £9 billion. And just in lost tax revenues alone, to say nothing of lost incomes for people around the country, just for the Treasury, is over £40 billion. That's mad. And that is not including, for example, the money we're losing out of related to smuggling because we don't now have a proper customs border. So we're losing money to smuggling as well. I mean, the actual cost is probably horrendous. I think sometimes you get figures like £100 billion a year bandied about. Wouldn't surprise me. But you can definitely say over 40 billion a year for certain without any assumptions being made beyond what the OBR make. They're saying we lost so much in trade and aid that we're far worse off outside the EU. Everything imported costs more, plus food is lower quality. Well, it doesn't, because of transport difficulties, even within the UK, because there's a shortage of transport, things aren't being done. So when you go to the supermarket and things don't last as long, it's because it's taken long. They can't get deliveries as quickly. I mean, if you pay more, if you go to like the posher supermarkets, you've got a better chance. Although even then, I sometimes get like grapes from Marks and Spencer's, like from Ocado, and I've stopped getting them now because they're better than Tesco. But sometimes they come and they're already mouldy. This never used to happen. Never used to happen. I mean, I noticed it straight away as someone who's done my own shopping since I was 18. I noticed, I noticed immediately the change in supermarkets. Well, I'm Pagan, they're saying, forget the economic facts and figures. Average voter only cares about their individual circumstances. Need to address this part of Brexit instead, as I reckon it'll have more cut through. Well, what I argued when I did that video earlier this week about the cost in lost taxes is, yes, I agree, put it into terms that people understand. So you divide that by the 27 million households in the country and you come up with a figure of about 1,500 quid. So that means the average household is paying an extra 1,500 quid a year in taxes. So if you're on the average income, because bear in mind, don't imagine that we load up taxes on the rich, So it's reasonable to say, actually, for the average household, that's an extra £1,500 in extra taxes you are paying because of the hard Brexit. So that's over 100 quid a month. I would suggest someone on an average income thinks 100 quid a month, over 100 quid a month is significant. So that's how I would put it in terms that people will understand. You're paying out an extra, 125 quid for Brexit. At least, and as I say, that's the figure we can derive without lots of like ifs and buts. Because like I said, we're also paying out, the government's also having to spend to maintain, the government is literally spending money to make trade harder, but it has to. Otherwise, we'll be letting we already are letting all sorts of shit into the country, but we have to try and slow it down at some point. Yeah, once again, we now pay billions far more in import and export duty we paid as a contribution to the EU. Yes. So again, if you think about it, the amount that a business would pay in its own taxes that is effectively being used for the EU membership fee, those businesses are now spending way more in, as you say, the cost of hiring staff to carry out the, or contracting staff, if they just get a customs agent to do it, to do their paperwork for them, as well as the extra cost of transport, which of course, if they're able to, they pass on to the customer, so we pay more. And if they can't, because they have to remain competitive, it's a hit to their profit. And if their profits are lower, that means they don't pay as much tax to the Treasury. So the Treasury gets less money from that. So as I say, the actual cost is more than even to the Treasury is more than this 40 billion quid. It's a bit over 40 billion quid, because there's lots of other things. It's just, I don't know what the other amounts are. But, businesses becoming less profitable means lower profits means they pay less tax. So that's less tax going to the Treasury for public services. The whole thing's a mess. Do we still export shellfish after Brexit? So the ones we can't export, we cannot, the famous one was we cannot export live bivalve mollusks unless they've been, because our water quality is not good enough. So you've got category A, B and C water quality. C is like, don't eat this stuff, right? Category A water is fine. If we've got like oysters and stuff to sell, that's harvested from Class A waters, we can still sell that to the EU. Problem is we don't really have that. And this is nothing to do with all the pollution in the rivers. It was before then even. We don't have that. We have Class B mostly. Actually, a lot of it could be Class C now, I don't know. But it was Class B, which means you can only sell it if it's been purified first. But the problem is there were no purification centres in the UK. They were in... So you can't send them for purification because you cannot export them to the EU unless they're purified, and you can't purify them unless you send them to the EU. So it was a catch-22. So no. Because that's the other thing. There are some goods, nothing even to do with tariffs. There are some goods we could just no longer export. What the hell are bivalve mollusks? Things like oysters and mussels and stuff. Because, you are what you eat. And if those sort of mollusks are eating polluted water, then if you eat them, yeah, that's bad for you. So they had to be purified, which means like given like clean water to drink for a bit. Do most of the Brexiteers making these arguments too concede to admit they were wrong? Not necessarily. You've got to remember, some of them will be, but some of them, it's just they're not getting this information. Where are they getting it from? Like, the Financial Times did quite a good video on Brexit, but of course, it's the Financial Times. It's doing it from the point of view of like an investor. So to someone who's got an interest in like economics in general, it's a really good video. Was it the sort of video that's going to get the message home to just the average person who's not a business owner? Not really. So and even then, like, although how many people read the Financial Times? Not many. So you're also, even though the video is free and it's on their YouTube channel, not many people would have come across it. I mean, actually, millions watched it, but I suspect a few people watched and rewatched it. I certainly did. There you go. Point later, why don't free market capitalists ever bring up the worst tax of them all, profit? It's a tax on private enterprise with no benefit back to public services. I think you've answered your own question there. They don't like it. Because this is where I and a capitalist will very much differ. My attitude is that every organisation needs to justify itself in terms of its benefit to society. I'm absolutely fine with the idea that a business is focused on profit and it should do whatever it legally can do for that profit. But that's where the government steps in. So the government should say, you need to benefit society. And how do you get them to do that? Obviously, regulation, legislation is one way, but also encouragement. You don't have to have everything black and white with a law. You can do it with taxes as well. Like, look at some taxes we use to try and influence behaviour. We accept that there's very high tax on tobacco because smoking's bad for you. We accept that there's a fair amount of tax on alcohol because drinking too much is bad for you. We have the sugar tax, which I'd be in favour of whacking right up. As the only thing I would say about taxes on food that's bad for you is obviously a lot of very processed food's bad for you, but it would be political suicide to slap it onto like ready meals and stuff, because people will say, well, they need those to literally live. But on things that are undeniably things you do not need, no matter how poor you are, like crisps and sweets and stuff, whack it up on those. Absolutely whack it up on food that's bad for you. But we already acknowledge the idea that it's fine to use taxation punitively. And then we also understand that you can use low taxation to encourage good behaviour, like pension. You know, so for example, when it comes to the tax you pay, you take pension contributions off, because it's like, no, saving for your future is a good thing, providing for your future is a good thing, so we won't tax that. So there's things like that. So use that more, you know, use it a lot more. If there's, you know, so consider the ways in which a business can legally still be not beneficial to society, and go, okay, well, we're not opposed enough to it to legislate against the behaviour, because, you know, there's a sort of the shades of grey here, so we'll just tax it instead. That's why you'd get along a lot better, you know, with the idea of utilising land tax. People keep going about wealth taxes when they won't work, or the wealth taxes they mean won't work. It's like, oh, we'll just tax this 1% of wealth. It's like, they'll just move the wealth. You won't tax any of it. In fact, you'll end up taxing less, because they'll move everything. So they won't even pay tax on the stuff they are now, because they'll just shift it all, right? Land tax. Reform land tax. You can't move land. And it again allows you to say certain uses of land are useful, so you won't pay very much. Like if something's been properly used as a farm, and you can define that, then you go, well, you won't pay any land tax because that's useful. Thank you very much. Jeremy Clarkson has 3 goats and a dog on his land. Now, that's not a farm. You can pay, you're wasting that land, so actually you can pay quite a high rate of tax. See how he likes that? Easier to fool someone than tell them they're a fool. See, that is the other problem you've got. Is that it's, well, I can't remember the exact wording of the saying, but it's basically, if someone cons you, and then you tell them they were conned, they're mad at you, not the one who conned them, because you're the one who made them look stupid. That is the problem. So it doesn't help as such to go around saying you were conned, mate, you were conned, mate, because people won't buy that. That hurts their ego. So what you'd better off doing is arguing. That's why you're better off arguing for the benefits of joining. You can even say things like, oh, they've got this thing in place, no, it's this. This is why I'd really like to see Macron's idea for this sort of secondary tier of membership, which is like economic benefits without such close political alignment, which is being designed for countries like Ukraine. But it could just as easily work here, because you could say to people, well, you weren't offered this, were you? Your objection was the political alignment, wasn't it? Yeah. Because they went on about that all the time. Oh, it's the political. Because remember, during the Brexit referendum campaign, we weren't going to leave the single market. Nigel Farage, of course we're not going to leave the single market. That'd be mad. You know, Daniel Hannan, no one's talking about leaving the single market. And he was right. No one was talking about leaving the single market. They all said we would stay. All of them. So what we need is to be able to say, well, so ideally what we'd have is single market membership. The problem at the moment is that freedom of movement. They've really poisoned the freedom of movement thing. But ideally what you'd have is some system where you can join the single market, but you don't have to join the political stuff. And if we could have that, you can sell that to people as, well, you were never offered this. So once we've done that and we're into that, then it's like, okay, this is brilliant. We're now getting loads more trade. Wouldn't it be better if we could decide the rules? Yeah, we should decide the rules. Well, we should join the EU proper then. Puneti's got 4 goats, not 3. Forgetting the one called Jeremy Clarkson. Yeah, I'm sorry. Anyway. Food Farming Countryside Commission campaign against unhealthy food due to the effects on health, high in sugar, salt, fat, ultra processed. Yeah, I mean, well, that's the thing. I mean, it's costing an absolute fortune for the NHS as well as lost productivity. It's costing an absolute fortune. It would inevitably be better if we could like remove this completely. However, just politically, if the way you do it, what you can't do is clobber cheap food that people can reasonably buy as a meal. Because with people in poverty, it's basically like saying, we're going to impoverish you even more. So politically, you can't do that. But you can hit foods that are not a meal. So crisps, biscuits, cake. Like this is the thing that always got me when I was young. And, my dad, because he owned his own business, had a macro, because like a wholesaler. So you go there and the prices there, unlike in shops in Britain in general, didn't include the VAT. So you had to add that on extra. But on some of the price things, because this is where like corner shops and stuff bought their stuff, though there's big boxes of crisps, which you can actually just get now. Anyway, but at the time, that's where like small shops used to go and do their shopping, right? To get the huge barrels of like oil and like big boxes of crisps and stuff like that. On some of the products, it would say 0 VAT. There's no VAT to pay on it. So this was the first time I was introduced to the fact that biscuits have VAT on them, which totally made sense to me. Fruit doesn't, made sense. Baby clothes doesn't, made sense. Cakes don't, didn't make sense. Didn't make sense. And it ended up with a huge, I mean, do you remember the tea cakes thing? Those people may remember the Marks and Spencer's tea cakes tax row. But yeah, that's an odd one. So cake should have VAT on it. I don't know why cake doesn't have VAT on it. Like, I don't know. Mr. Kipling must have been on the commission when they were implementing VAT, because that's mad to me. I mean, I don't know why we don't do that. I know they said they weren't going to increase the rate of VAT. Why don't they say, as part of a health drive, we're not going to change the rate of VAT, but they could take it off some things that are actually good, useful, and then they could stick it on things that, like, put it on bloody cake. Carol there said, I like your piece about having to deal with Trump, and yes, the UK will have to deal with Trump and keep him on side. You cannot, like, if Trump forces into a situation where he says, look, we are going to apply these tariffs unless you, like, we're going to apply these tariffs, which is going to cost your treasury 20 billion quid, 22 billion quid, I think it might be, I don't know, something like that. But we won't if you do this thing that costs you 30 billion or 40 billion. It's like, well, so we're forced, if we're forced into a position where he demands something that's not worth it, then yeah, we'll have to take the hit. But we shouldn't just abandon it because it's mad. I said to a couple of people in the comments who were saying, we should give him nothing at all. Oh, you're fine with the NHS getting 20 billion quid a year less than you? Are you fine with that? Because the money will have to come off somewhere. Rachel, I still think there was some scope for some extra taxation that Rachel Reeves didn't apply, granted, yeah. Not 20 odd billion worth. So the bottom line is, if we do get hit with these tariffs, then I don't know. There's going to have to be some cuts. There's going to have to be. So, of course, we should try and at least dodge that. Unless, of course, we can compensate somewhere else. But even if Starmer gets what he wants with the EU, that's not going to compensate for 20 odd billion a year, I don't think. Not in Treasury revenues, anyway. Predator, they're saying, you previously said the Tories would turn on Brexit when public opinion was rejoin. Given their lack of sense, could we see a general election where Labour's offering rejoin and Tories not? It is possible, I suppose, but the problem is that people will wave polls around and go, look, all these people want to join the EU, and it's like, no, you're using a fiddled poll, mate. They are all fiddled. I'll tell you the usual ways they're fiddled. The first way is if you see a poll that says certain percentage would like to rejoin the EU and a certain percentage wouldn't, and that's it, it's fiddled, because they've removed, there needs to be 4 results on it to be meaningful. It has to be, would you rejoin the EU? So yes, no, don't know, or wouldn't vote. If they're not, the wouldn't vote, okay, in theory, you could sensibly remove those if you like. But the don't knows are not people who won't vote. So you have to include those on. The other thing is, if it's just a poll that says, would you rejoin the EU, yes or no? And that's it. That's not valid either, because a lot of people don't know what's involved in rejoining. They think we just get to say to the EU, can we have what we had? Because the EU will say no. No. We're going to talk about currency. We're going to talk about Schengen, which would need Ireland on board, but I don't know that Ireland wouldn't be on board. We're going to talk about, this, that, and the other, and stuff like that. So there'd be negotiations. So, and that has been tested. There is a poll that comes out quite regularly that says, would you rejoin the EU, yes or no? And then it says, would you rejoin the EU if it meant adopting the euro? And the number that would say they would rejoin always drops. And it drops below the point at which you've got a majority for rejoining. So we're not, as much as some people find solace in polls that are not being properly analysed, we're not there yet. And it is distressing. I mean, it was really good when just the Chancellor and Andrew Bailey just made these simple statements last week. It actually got a bit of discussion in the media, not enough, but it got some. So if we could just keep getting that narrative going, that the government accept that Brexit is a harm. So we've gone from a position where the government have said Brexit has opportunities, we just haven't unlocked them yet, to a government saying, no, Brexit is damage, but we can't do anything about it, or we can't do much about it. Hence the red lines, which are really the public's red lines. As soon as the public, or this is where it doesn't matter about the majority, as soon as the key voters don't have those red lines, neither will Labour. Labour would, in a heartbeat, the majority of the cabinet, the vast majority of the cabinet, including the leader, are people who wish we'd never left and would like to rejoin if it was politically easy. Most Labour MPs, same thing. Most Labour members, most Labour voters. So it's very, very easy. It's really down to those target voters. Viv saying that the EU have to want us to join and persuade all 27 countries. Okay, what Phil is saying. That is the other thing as well. I mean, let's make no bones about this. At one point, we are going to ask to rejoin, right? I'd like there to be a stepping stone in the form of Macron's idea, but we are going to at some point. When we do, there are countries who will try to horse, because that's how the EU works. There will be horse trading. There will be countries who will block us unless we give them something. And some of those countries, it'll be a case of, yeah, whatever, that's fine. Some of those countries, they could actually just block. I mean, remember, when we finally decided to join the EEC, that was blocked by France for quite a while, remember. Don't imagine it's going to be different this time. It won't be. But ironically, if we can, I mean, it's not just Trump, just even Biden, remember, was already trying to focus more attention on the Pacific. It's like, it doesn't matter about Trump. America sees its strategic interests in the Pacific, not Europe. So remember, before Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Biden was already talking about scaling back in Europe. They won't go completely, but scaling back in Europe. So even if you're looking ahead of Trump, and if you assume democracy somehow holds in America and Trump is replaced by a sensible president of whichever party, which seems incredible at the moment to think that, but that's possible. Even then, they're still going to think they should scale back from Europe. So we have to accept that now. And that's where, there should be some momentum in the UK and the EU moving much closer together on security grounds, at which point you can then have more sensible discussions on everything else. Blair was once the most pro-EU PM we've ever had. Could Starmer steal this title from him? Well, it's not. I mean, it's an unofficial title. I mean, you know, Starmer. I mean, Blair went the full works. He went to France and actually spoke French. But I will say this: he started quite well in that. One thing that Tony Blair famously did was humiliate Nigel Farage. Now, Starmer had a crack at that this Wednesday. It wasn't quite as good, but it was pretty good. The thing is, I suspect he won't take that title because Starmer is going to be seen as a Brexit Prime Minister because of his red lines. But in reality, if you ask the average person on the street who was the most famous figure arguing for us to not leave the EU, they'll say Keir Starmer. You know, he was the most influential Remainer. So this idea that people have that he's now like a Brexiteer, it's like, really? So he went from being Mr. Remainer to a Brexiteer. It's like, do you think he got kicked in the head by a horse in 2020? Because, you know, or do you think it was a change in political situation? And as I say, if the Labour government really were committed to Brexit, they would not be making statements. In fact, let's put it this way. They have not made a single statement that Brexit will be a benefit. Even this Make Brexit Work, even that doesn't say that we can get back what we had via some other route. It just means be a functioning state whilst Brexit is a thing. Labour have not officially made any statement to the effect that Brexit is in any way beneficial. The only thing they've said is we understand why people voted leave and we need to listen to those people. But it would also be nice if a government also listened to the people who didn't think we should leave. But there it is. John, they're saying, I would argue PR and media reform are needed before applying to join the EU. So would I. But I don't think it's a ladder thing in terms of campaigning. Potentially in terms of sequencing. It's like there's no point in campaigning. Like I would say of the ones which is the most urgent, media reform, then PR or electoral reform, but PR, and then joining the EU. But you have to campaign for all of them because it's not like you can go, okay, we'll campaign for this for 3 years and then we'll get it and then we'll do this because there's no guarantee of any of them. So you have to campaign for all of them as much as possible. But there it is anyway. We'll leave it there. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a great rest of evening. And until next time, I'll see you later.